He joins me now. Congressman, I know you're a no because it's a party line vote. What do you make of the developments today?
Well, I couldn't agree more with my colleague, Representative Aguilar. Ultimately, my Republican colleagues are going to have to answer to the American people as to how they could possibly justify cutting Medicaid to the tune of $800 billion, food assistance to the tune of $200 million, all to pay for, in part, tax cuts for the richest Americans, billionaires and corporations. It's a betrayal of the middle class, and as you've noted on this program, not a single Democrat voted in support of this proposal tonight for exactly that reason. It's a reckless economic scheme that I ultimately believe will be deeply unpopular with the American people, and we're already starting to see some of that outrage in the town halls that have developed across the country over just the last few days. It's unfortunate that none of my Republican colleagues, at least at this juncture, it appears, are willing to stand up for their own constituents, but we'll have to see how this unfolds.
It's always dangerous to do budget math like live on the air, but something I think is worth noting here is that $3.5 trillion is to extend the parts of the Trump tax cuts that are going to expire, which are only expiring because they wanted to kind of like artificially reduce the size of them, right? So largely the sort of overwhelming benefits go to the wealthiest households. I think the top 5% gets about half of that value. Think about that for a second. But then because they want to add another business tax cut and more tax cuts on top of it, that's why they got to go hunting in the fields of Medicaid to try to cut that stuff to go more, right? Do I have that right?
Your math is spot on. You've articulated well precisely what this economic scheme seeks to do, and it's on the backs of hardworking Americans who rely on Medicaid, which, as you've covered extensively on your program, a lot of Americans ultimately rely on these programs. You think about the Americans in Colorado and Washington State and California from coast to coast, each of whom are trying to access life-saving care through the Affordable Care Act or through Medicaid, who ultimately will lose their health care by virtue of this bill if this resolution is ultimately signed into law. So the stakes are incredibly high, and you've articulated well why they are doing it. They are doing it to pay for, in part, because, of course, this bill would increase the deficit, as Tom Massie, a Republican member, of course, from Kentucky, has noted, and apparently Elon Musk concurred with earlier today. But it's purely to pay for tax cuts for the richest Americans. We believe that that's deeply unfair and imprudent, and we're hoping that through this process at some point Republicans will read the room and join us in defending working-class Americans.
I should note that they have the number that they need, 217. So this is going to pass this budget resolution. We sort of expected all day that it would, although, again, I said this with Sahil, I think it's just important because one of the dynamics here is Trump has been acting as a king or playing the role of king. He called himself a king. Elon Musk has been playing the role of like CEO, like the worst boss you've ever had in your life. And part of that is because they hate Congress because Congress, they don't really like the constitutional order. But part of it is because they can't pass the things they're trying to do by executive fiat, right? Like, am I wrong about that? Do they have the votes to do the kind of stuff that the cuts they're doing sort of by fiat? Do you think they could pass them in the House?
I think that remains an open question, Chris. I mean, I will just say I have been astounded to see my colleagues on the other side of the aisle capitulate time and time again. You could go back to the impeachment trial of 4 years ago that you covered so extensively. And clearly, if past is prologue, that's likely to continue. But I don't disagree with you that the flooding of the zone with these lawless and unconstitutional executive orders, clearly there are some things they would like to do in the Congress that they simply don't have sufficient votes for. And ultimately, that's why they've decided on this unconstitutional course that they've been pursuing that's been rebuffed in so many federal courts. But if tonight's vote is any indication, it's clear that Republicans intend to support President Trump every step of the way, irrespective of how much harm will come to the American people, as I believe that we're going to see if this bill is signed into law.
Federal District Court Judge Amir Ali in Washington today telling the Trump administration, you shut down foreign aid funds. And it appears at first glance that you were not legally allowed to do that. I ordered you to immediately restart those funds, and you have not done so. You now have until tomorrow to do it. And if you can't do it, or you have some excuse that makes you think you still ought not do it, I want the relevant officials in my courtroom and under oath telling me why they are not doing it. The motion to enforce is granted. Get those funds out the door by midnight tomorrow night. This nonsense is over. Just a humiliation for the Trump administration in court today. Not only not doing what they are legally required to do, but unable to even spit out a complete sentence justifying why they're not complying with the court's order. Just a legal disaster and a humiliation. And that court recessed after the judge gave his order at 1:09 p.m. today. And exactly 10 minutes later, at 1:19 p.m., 10 minutes after that legal humiliation today, this New York Times headline posted, "Doge quietly deletes the 5 biggest spending cuts it celebrated last week." So while we're on the theme of the Trump administration being humiliated, I mean, literally within 10 minutes of a federal judge ordering President Trump and his top campaign donor, Elon Musk, to undo the biggest thing they have yet done to the United States government, their shutdown of all foreign aid. 10 minutes after that court order to fix that by tomorrow or be prepared to be in my courtroom testifying under oath as to why you are breaking this lawful order. 10 minutes of that, within 10 minutes of that, the New York Times posts this story on how the 5 largest other things they claim to have done to the U.S. government aren't real. And so they've had to take them down off their website and stop claiming that they did them. Quote, last week, Elon Musk's government cost slashing initiative, which he calls the Department of Government Efficiency, posted an online, quote, wall of receipts, celebrating how much it had saved by canceling federal contracts. Now, the organization has deleted all of the 5 biggest, quote, savings on that original list, after the New York Times and other media outlets pointed out that those lists were riddled with errors. Quote, the last of the original top 5 disappeared from the site in the early hours of Tuesday. The website offered no explanation for why it had removed some items. But these were the original 5 largest savings on its list. First, an $8 billion cut at ICE, at Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The actual contract in question was worth not $8 billion, but $8 million. Next, 3 $655 million cuts at USAID. Quote, this was actually a single cut that was erroneously counted 3 times. In addition to not being $655 million 3 times, it's now only listed once, and instead of being listed at $655 million, it's listed at $18 million. So they were off there by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But wait, there's one more, a $232 million cut at the Social Security Administration, which appears actually, according to reporting from The Intercept, to be a project that is not worth $232 million. It is worth $560,000. So we're only off by... how big is the window on your calculator? And does it need batteries? So they're not sending their best. I mean, to the extent that we are supposed to think of the authoritarian overthrow of the U.S. system of government as some sort of benevolent mission, because these are math geniuses who are doing it, right? To the extent that that's why we're supposed to like the dismantling of the U.S. government, because they're so good at math, and so therefore this must be good for us. Yeah, it turns out their math doesn't work. And even though they are having to rescind by court order the things they are most proud of doing, the biggest things they're trying to do, or they're having to rescind from their wall of receipts everything they previously said about all their other best and biggest moves, even though all of this stuff is getting wound back. Literally, all of the biggest things they said they have done are now getting undone, or they never happened in the first place. Even still, though, it's not like they're getting better or more humble or more accurate over time. Back to that New York Times article today, quote, some of the new canceled contracts Doge added to its website this week appear to make some of the same types of errors. The largest savings on the latest version of its list is a $1.9 billion cut at the Treasury Department. But as reported in the Times last week, that contract was actually canceled last fall when Joe Biden was president and when Doge did not yet exist. So that $1.9 billion isn't anything they did either. Even the stuff they say is their best, their biggest successes, their greatest hits, has all fallen apart under the most cursory scrutiny. And, you know, what have they done? They have fired a lot of people. And then they've had to unfire a lot of them when they realized that they actually had no idea who they were firing. We had the oops firings of workers at the National Nuclear Security Administration. Oops. Wrong people to fire. Those had to be rescinded. Oops. Had to hire those people back. We had the oops firings of the people who work on bird flu. Oops. Wrong people to fire. Those people have to be unfired and brought back. Now, news that they're trying to unfire the people who work in really simple, really easy to replicate low productivity fields like overseeing the safety of the robots that do surgeries on humans. And the people who work on the safety of pacemakers and implanted defibrillators. Yeah, that's a waste of time. That's a waste of money. Who needs those things to be safe? Fire those people. Trying to unfire those people now.
Thank you for holding an informative session there where we're actually learning something about how government was working up until 2 weeks ago.
Right. And, you know, put it in a little context here. Think about Donald Trump. When he ran for president, he spent a year telling everybody in America he was going to lower costs for families. Remember how he said repeatedly, his words, he would lower costs on day one. That's what he kept saying. And here we are. We're in the second month of the Trump term. And not only has he done nothing to lower costs, instead, what he's doing is he's shut down, he's sidelined this consumer agency that actually helps people and has returned money to people when they've been cheated. So he's driving up costs for consumers, for families, instead of pushing them down, exactly the reverse of what he promised.
So this is an agency which, by design, returns a profit directly to the American people, directly to the consumers it protects.
Yep. Yeah, in fact, think about it this way. What this agency found is they found over the last dozen years $21 billion of places where banks and credit card companies and payday lenders and online money transfer outfits and your bank, your checking account, had cheated people, had tricked them, had trapped them, but clearly had broken the law. They found it. They got in touch with them. They went after them. They prosecuted them. And most of all, made them return the money directly to people they cheated. Now, just so you understand, when you sideline that agency, all of that activity stops. And that's basically what we talked about today. The thousands and thousands and thousands of people who turn to the consumer agency every day, more than 7 million people have gone to the consumer agency's hotline to get help in individual matters. All of that process, we just did a report on this, it slows way down because there's nobody at the agency to be able to handle it. The agency had about 40 lawsuits that it was in the middle of, that it was going forward after some of the worst actors fighting it out in courts. All of that has stopped. 2 weeks ago, I had Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, in front of me in a banking hearing and asked him, so who's enforcing the consumer protection laws across the country right now? His answer, no one.
Senator, I learned a lot in today's hearing, especially this point that had not really been clear to me before. that so much of the work of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is invisible to us.
Yes.
There are corrections that can show up on our bank statements or credit card statements or different things that maybe just the company did that. It turns out the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau did it and isn't getting credit for it by the people who are being protected. Why can't that be made more clear to the people who benefit by that protection?
Well, partly we do try to make it clear by coming here and talking with you and all the people who listen, and I'm grateful for that. But do understand, this is frankly a part of how a government infrastructure should work. You know, I don't ask for the engineering reports on the bridge. What I know is that I have a government I can trust and an Army Corps of Engineers that make sure it's a safe bridge to be able to travel over. The same kind of thing should be true with our financial infrastructure. You should be able to take out a mortgage or use a credit card or an online payments transfer and not have to worry that somebody is cheating you and cheating you in ways you may never see because they tricked you on fees they charged you that they legally couldn't do, the ways they calculated interest. There are 1,000 ways to cheat people. We know, we've watched them do it. And the whole idea here is not for people to be able to have to read these credit card agreements that used to be 30 pages long. It's to make the market work smoothly so people can try to build some financial security and know that the basic underpinnings, that you're treated just fairly, level playing field with your credit cards, your checking accounts, your mortgage, your car loans. That's what the CFPB is all about. It's kind of like your infrastructure in your financial system. And damn it, Elon Musk thinks he can just come in and knock all that out because it will be one more way for the richest man on earth to get just a little bit richer at the expense of American families. And this is a time just to say no. No to Elon Musk, no to Donald Trump, and no to these damn billionaires who think they ought to be able to run the earth and make everybody else eat dirt. Enough of that.
Joining us now, staff writer with The Atlantic and author of Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World, Anne Applebaum. And it's really good to be here with you. I guess the question I have that's been bugging me, there was a reason why Europe started to disarm itself. It got very tense, very angry, led to a couple of pretty big fights that we all got involved in. They've been leaning heavily on us now for the past 70, 80 years. What sort of world are we walking into when Europe starts to rearm, the Western nations start to rearm, and they start to take a more forceful position without the United States?
You're really right to point to the big picture, because this is really something extraordinary that's happening. 80 years of a world in which America helped create zones of prosperity and safety in Europe as well as Asia, to the benefit of the United States, to the benefit of U.S. companies, to the benefit of U.S. culture, and to the benefit of everybody involved, actually, is now coming to an end. President Trump has indicated that he, in many different ways, that he doesn't feel aligned with Europe. He doesn't see the United States as the leader of the democratic world. He doesn't need those kinds of alliances. He's not planning on using them in elsewhere in the world as American presidents did in the past. And that is leading Europeans to redefine who they are and what they want to be. And yes, there will be more defense spending. There will be conversations. I mean, I don't want to be apocalyptic, but there'll be certainly conversations among U.S. allies in Europe and Asia about nuclear weapons. Do we need them now? If the U.S. nuclear umbrella is no longer guaranteed, a system that was created to avoid war, to push away war, as I said, to create prosperity, is now going to be slowly replaced with something very different. And I'm not sure that Americans are going to like it.
Maybe this is a dumb question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Just looking at the way Donald Trump talks about the world and what he's wanted to do since he's come back to office. You know, he wants to take Greenland. He wants Canada to be the 51st state. He wants to retake the Panama Canal, taking over Gaza. He's cozying up toward Vladimir Putin again as Putin wants to expand his territory. He also has an affinity for MBS. It seems like maybe there's some affinity there, although it's kind of unclear, toward Xi Jinping. Is this somebody who has intentions of creating a new world order that looks more like the empire system of the past? Is that just taking a leap too far?
All I can say is if that's what if he's not doing that, then he's sounding a lot like it. I mean, you're absolutely right. He speaks about other countries, other sovereign countries, as if they were fake states or failed states. He talks about other territory that's not part of the United States as if it should be his, as if it should be somehow handed over without question. He's acting as if borders don't matter. He's aligning himself with other dictators who have also treated their neighbors poorly and treated their own populations poorly. Russia is a repressive state in which there is no freedom of speech, in which opposition leaders are murdered. Is that the kind of state that the United States wants to resemble? Is that the leader? Is Putin the leader that the United American president admires and whose language he imitates? I'm wondering whether Americans are going to be happy that their country is no longer seen as a democracy around the world or seen as a country that promotes stability, and safety and prosperity, and whether they're going to be happy with an America aligned with aggressive, extortionate dictatorships. It's a very, very big change.
Can we linger on that? When you say Americans aren't going to be happy with that change, what is it going to look like for us? And I know you've written also about Doge. I wonder, this Doge experience and what Elon Musk is trying to do to the federal government, does that fold into this new vision of how this country, aligned with these other authoritarian governments, might look in the future, or they might be pushing us toward?
I mean, maybe. I mean, I was listening to your last segment, actually, and I was listening to people talk about why Musk is using these particular kinds of tactics. I mean, it seems very clear to me that his intention is not to create government efficiency. Then why would he be firing random people? He might be firing good people. His intention is to change the nature of the civil service so that civil servants become loyalists, so they pass purity tests, so that they're afraid to have their own views. They respond only to the whim of the leader. I mean, that does sound like political systems that to most Americans would be pretty unfamiliar. So it feels like both domestically and internationally, they're seeking to change the nature of who we are, who we have been, at least for the last 80 years. And I think as Americans begin to understand that the nature of their country, the definition of who we are, is becoming something different, they might be very surprised.
Do you think that there is a chance for Emmanuel Macron, for Keir Starmer, for Western leaders to convince Donald Trump to stick by them? We saw Emmanuel Macron trying to give what is, probably a masterclass, all things considered, in somebody who is not aligned with Donald Trump, trying to flatter his way into alignment, trying to pretend like they're the best of friends and then gently push back where he needed to. Do you see that as having any runway?
It's hard to know for them to know what to do, because flattery makes you look idiotic, and I don't think President Trump really respects it. And anger doesn't have any impact either. That's not successful. I think what's gradually going to happen is that we will see European leaders beginning to make their own path and make decisions that may not be beneficial to the United States, but decisions about trade and decisions about security that will lead them in a different direction. I mean, we're still in the very beginning of this change, this big sea change, and maybe it's not going to go very well, and maybe it'll hit a roadblock pretty soon, and the change won't be as dramatic as it looks right now. But you can already hear people in Europe and Asia and other American allies around the world, but also others who have admired the United States for what it was in the past, beginning to say, we need something different now. And so for the moment, they'll continue talking to Trump and doing their best. I mean, you can't really ask them to do anything else. But in the future, you might hear different kinds of voices.
The first question to you, take us through what happened on this House vote and what comes next.
Right. So this was the first step in what is going to be a very long process to pass every single element of Donald Trump's agenda, from border security to defense spending to energy policy, and of course the signature element of this, which is extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the signature Trump tax cuts bill, if you will. The Senate passed a different budget resolution last week that only targets the non-tax elements of this. And this is important because the House and Senate ultimately have to pass the same budget resolution in order for all of this to move forward. Now, the House's budget resolution does not allow for the 2017 Trump-era tax cuts to be made permanent. That is a key demand of Senate Republican leadership, especially Majority Leader John Thune and Majority Whip John Barrasso. So that is one of the key differences between these two pieces of legislation. They're going to have to reconcile them at some point. And then after that, they're going to have to get down into the details of what's called reconciliation instructions. I know this is all very wonky and procedural, but it's very important. And it's going to take several months to ultimately get this done if they can actually get the votes for this. Again, I want to stress this was simply a first step.
David, this used to be your jam. What's your reaction to what we saw on the Hill tonight?
So I think we should assume, based on historic precedent, that when a Republican controls the White House, the Senate, and the House, everything will kind of get done. And I think that's the case. I think this kind of foretells that President Trump's agenda is actually going to get through the Congress. I think the most important thing is, from my personal experience, the math never actually adds up. Ever, ever, ever. And so earlier today, there were 4 to 14 holdouts. They all fell in line except for one. The bottom line is nobody cares. Everybody looks the other way at debt and deficits and all that other stuff. This will allow Republicans to pass border control. They will pass an extension of the Trump tax cuts. It'll either be permanent or not. They'll say it's paid for, but it's not. It ultimately is going to increase the national debt, and Republicans will figure out a way to say that it didn't.
Okay, so let's say we even take debt and deficit off the table, because at the end of the day, people talk about it, but when it comes down to it, it doesn't matter. If this thing goes through, we're going to enact trillions in tax cuts that are going to be funded in part by cutting Medicaid. Is that going to be? I mean, I can't imagine. You know, yes, they'll get it through, but who's that popular for?
So I think to Andrew's point, today was a procedural vote, and they'll still have another procedural vote. But at some point, they're going to have a very substantive vote. And so call it the Republican Medicaid caucus. Is that 10 members in swing districts that expressed concerns? Obviously, today it wasn't a big enough concern for them. I do think what this all sets up, Stephanie, so elections have consequences. Republicans will pass their agenda this session. I really think they will, as much as Democrats try to protest. But I think that the issues of economic disparity, the wealth gap, money in politics, the corruption of billionaires in politics becomes an overwhelming issue in the midterms for Democrats to grab onto, because that is a theme of the current Trump-Musk administration.
It's also the root of what Donald Trump originally ran on.
Sure, but look... Right? I mean, you can go to the blue collar or farm worker in Iowa who says, I voted for Donald Trump because he's like me. It's part of the mystique of
Remember
Donald
Drain
Trump.
the Swamp?
Yeah, right, Drain the Swamp. But what Donald Trump is doing is, I think the net worth of Elon Musk has increased more than the entire budget of USAID since the election, right? And so there's a fiction to all of this. But I do think the American people see this. They see the corruption of money in politics, and the threat is from the wealth gap to corruption and grift and graft. Democrats will find their footing on this. I do think the election of last November has consequences, and as much as Democrats will resist, Republicans showed us tonight they're going to pass Donald Trump's agenda.
All right, new topic. Jeff, obviously there is still a lot we do not know about this potential minerals deal with Ukraine. How does it change the relationship between our two countries? And what exactly, I know, again, we only have a limited amount of information. At this point, what does it seem like Ukraine's getting, and what are we getting?
All good questions. I would start by answering sort of the politics of this. If it ends up being what it looks like, it would be a victory for President Trump in terms of getting something in return for the U.S. aid and the money and arms that have gone to helping Ukraine in the war with Russia. And that's been really important to him. So if there ends up being a deal that the two of them can sign, and by the two of them, I mean President Trump and President Zelensky, that will probably strengthen a relationship that has been a little fraught, to say the least, over the last week, with both men sort of trading barbs about the other. In terms of the actual details, what the initial reporting shows is that there will be a fund of some kind that the Ukrainians will pay into, that the United States will get a benefit from, up to $500 billion. And that will be seen as sort of a payback for what the United States has already invested into Ukrainian defense. You also asked, what does Ukraine get out of it? That's a question that I think we're going to have to keep asking, because what Ukraine wants is some kind of security guarantees. You did hear the president saying today that it might be necessary to have a peacekeeping force of some kind in Ukraine in order for a peace to be continued, or a peace to stay after a peace deal is created. That's something that the Kremlin doesn't want, that President Putin of Russia doesn't want. So we'll see if that ends up happening. But the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian leadership want security guarantees of some kind. And perhaps just having the United States have an interest in Ukrainian minerals will be a step towards that.
David, it seems like Zelensky was feeling the pressure here. If this happens, will this be a big win for President Trump with the American people?
No, I don't think so. I think this landed like a thud with Republicans of all walks of life.
Tell us why.
Because they actually know there's no way to get to Donald Trump's position that Vladimir Putin is anything but a dictator. So you can say we're spending too much money on Ukraine, but to suggest that Zelensky's a dictator and Vladimir Putin isn't landed like a thud in Republican politics. Now, what can he do? I mean, the truth is, Ukraine was only competitive in the war against Russia because of the aid from the United States and Europe. I mean, despite all their valor, their commitment, the loss of life, the remarkable, honorable leadership of Ukrainians, they relied on the United States. Donald Trump abandoned them. He surrendered. And he surrendered, and so did Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz. They surrendered to Vladimir Putin, and you saw the likes of Macron in Europe say, holy you know what? Yeah, holy cow.
Smokes.
Like, what just changed in the United States? And even Republicans are sharing the European viewpoint on this. But if you're Zelensky, you can't do anything else. Donald Trump just put him over a barrel, and it's a shameful moment in American history.
Okay.
But it's a lot of people, Steph, will see this as unpatriotic and question what do the Russians have on Donald Trump, whether or not they do or not. We know factually he sides with Russia. A lot of Americans will be asking why.
A lot of informed people will.
That's right.
But think about all sorts of other people that Donald Trump is going to say, look, we were spending an unlimited amount of money in Ukraine, getting nothing back, and I fought and got something. I strong-armed my way to get it.
For the last 70 to 80 years, peace in the West and the strength of the Western alliance has been centered around protecting the West from Russian aggression. And that goes back to 6 months ago. And Donald Trump just said that's no longer the foreign policy of the United States. Russia is an aggressor. They're not our ally. They're our adversary. We should ally with Europe. We should ally with Ukraine. And Donald Trump said, we're not going to do that anymore. This is a major shift that empowers an enemy, not an ally.
New topic. Andrew, it feels like Republicans on the Hill are starting to gently speak up about the DOGE cuts. Watch this.
I think they need to be more targeted and they need to be more thoughtful. I think, President Trump has appointed some really wonderful people to lead his agencies. And these secretaries of the various departments should be looking at the agency, seeing where efficiencies can be made, seeing where there's too much overhead.
Just a little bit of humanity and dignity to the process, I think, is what many of the Alaskan federal employees are asking for, and I don't think that that's asking for too much. There is a way to do this that is proper, that is lawful, and also treats our federal employees with a little bit of dignity.
I think that any process you undergo where you're trying to find efficiencies And if that involves some reductions in force, it needs to be done in a respectful way. Obviously, that's respectful of people involved. But I do think as they go through this process, the objective of DOGE is to try and figure out ways to make government run more efficiently.
And that objective is a good one, Andrew. It seems like their problem isn't with the goals of DOGE, but how they're doing it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would add to that Senator Thom Tillis, Republican of North Carolina, by the way, up for re-election in 2026. So he's got a political interest in weighing in on all of this. He compared this to really, he said it's like a customer service problem, right? Citizens of the United States expect government services for them, things like veterans benefits, things like Social Security Administration, things like national parks being open and operating, right? When that stuff starts to get cut and Americans start to feel that, at a certain point, even if they voted for Donald Trump, they're questioning, hey, why is this happening, right? And that's why you're seeing so many Republicans, particularly in these town halls from over the last week or so, really starting to feel that from their constituents, many of whom, again, voted for Donald Trump, but are thinking to themselves, wait, I didn't vote for this. I didn't want these types of essential services to be cut. And that's even apart from the whole argument that you heard from John Thune and Lisa Murkowski, for example, on the idea of doing this in a very sort of compassionate way. So that is something that we're going to continue to hear, I think, from Republicans, especially those like Thom Tillis and others who are up for re-election in 2026 and are going to be facing the voters sooner than anyone else.
One thing that I hear a lot from national security folks is that after 9/11, it was Robert Mueller and George Tenet who appeared on Capitol Hill to testify before Congress more than any cabinet officials in the history of the country, and that the FBI for a period was as known for never again failing to connect the dots. What happens to the national security functions of the FBI under what the New York Times describes, at the FBI at least, the two least experienced men to ever lead that department?
Right, well, it's a combination of two things. They've put in two very inexperienced people, neither of whom have spent a day at the FBI, and they're the ones who will be leading this organization. And at the same time, they've removed about half a dozen or so of the senior leaders at the FBI, the people who had decades of experience and expertise on matters like counterterrorism and national security and domestic crimes. And there's also something of a brewing war against the rank and file. One of the things that the new Justice Department leadership did a couple of weeks ago is demand that every one of the FBI agents who worked in any way on the January 6th investigation and prosecutions provide information about what role they exactly played. And the memorandum which directed this, which had the subject line terminations, said this information was being collected specifically in order to review the data for possible personnel actions. Now, the January 6th investigation, that was the largest investigation in the Bureau's history. It touched thousands and thousands of agents across the country. They're all now swept up in this process, too. So you are simultaneously bringing in highly inexperienced people at the top and removing the senior leadership and at least threatening to remove some of the core rank and file. And look, you know, the FBI has an extraordinarily important mission. You know, they are the lead investigative agency in our government that protects against all sorts of violence, bomb threats, organized crime, gang violence, as well as fraud and public corruption and other white-collar crime. I mean, you go on and on and on. And if you put people at the top who have no real experience in leading FBI federal law enforcement, then you're going to systematically degrade the capability of the government to perform those functions. And that's something we're all going to suffer from over the course of the next few years.
I mean, I think that's the most ominous piece of this, that there are no winners when the Department of Justice and the FBI become political weapons to be used, to be wielded on behalf of anybody, but on behalf of someone who is promising to purge the department of all this talent and all of these individuals who were part of, as Peter said, the largest investigation in the department's history.
So just to add to more bad news, the people who are assigned to have some sort of checking oversight function are all being fired or have been fired. The Inspector Generals, a group called the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. I remember when I was at the Bureau, I thought they were just phenomenal, bipartisan, so important to have them. It was an oversight functioning. The Office of Special Counsel, where they're in the process of trying to remove Mr. Dellinger, who heads that. That's not to be confused with the special counsel.
Right.
It's a separate agency. You then can have the same conversation that we just had about the Department of Justice, sort of my home, of Main Justice and the FBI. You can have that exact conversation of the hollowing out of that in terms of wanting to have the people who lead it be just loyal to a person, a king, and have that conversation in an area that's, I think, equally, if not more, terrifying, which is the military. You have the leaders also being removed, and you have the lawyers, the lead lawyers there being removed. And that is, as a lawyer, that is so important, because what you know when you are at the department or if you're at the JAG is that you actually owe your loyalty to the Constitution, and it's completely bipartisan, and that military justice is a really strong thing, in the same way that at the FBI and at Main Justice, it is about the rule of law. And so you are seeing this in so many areas. But just to take two, it's the Department of Justice and the military. If you are planning on running a fascist regime, that's what you attack.
Well, to Peter's point and to Andrew's point, that is not what people thought they were getting. And it did not have to happen. I mean, the reason it happened is because Republicans agreed to let it happen. Why?
That's right. So look, at the voter level, 90% of politics happens in the low information space. It's not the most flattering term, but I don't think most people, even today, fully would understand what we're talking about here. But certainly Republicans on the Hill did. And the reason they've allowed it is because they're followers, not leaders. The one ability to rush to a crisis, and I think we are in a crisis. This is not just words by Ed Martin. This is the ethos of Donald Trump and the administration. The one ability to immediately rush to a crisis is the power of impeachment. I mean, that's it. We can go through all the mechanics of hearings and so forth, but it's power of impeachment, and Republicans have said they're not going to do that. So what does it leave us with? It leaves us with relying on an informed citizenry. And citizenship requires a diligence. Patriotism requires a commitment. And we know there is likely more damage to occur before we can use the democratic tools of citizenry to push back and to fight back. But I do think it's there. We know it's there. We're seeing it in town halls this week. We're seeing it in the coverage you provide. And I think we discussed this before. In these very dark days, I kind of focus on what is the offense that we can be playing as a country. And I always break it down to three things: oppose, propose, and prepare. We have to give voice to the opposition against all of this, because if we don't, imagine a vacuum where the concerns are not being shared among the electorate. And I think we have to propose a way forward that honors the Constitution and looks different. What would happen if we're able to change the presidency or the Congress in 2 years? What does that look like? Does it mean an impeachment? Does it mean hearings? Does it mean censure? What does it mean? And then preparing. I mean, the one tool we have are elections. That is the most basic of our democratic tools.
Yeah.
And we have to prepare what should be a groundswell of opposition to what we're seeing that shows up next November.
I think there is the only thing I disagree with is I don't think the 90% of the public had no information. I think they didn't believe it. And I think they had too much faith in checks and balances. I think they nominated, a drunk uncle, but they didn't want him to drive. They wanted him in the back of the limo, being a lunatic, the people that voted for him. They didn't think he would, put on his blindfold, put his equally insane cousin from South Africa, in the seat next to him and drive the car off the cliff. And I think that you can't call the citizens of this country low information if you watch any of those town halls. They are saying things that if you only watch Fox News, you have worked to find out that Trump is destroying the Constitution.
Sure.
If you're a MAGA voter, you voted for Trump, and you like some of what he was saying, and he scared you enough about immigration or whatever else he was ranting and raving about, and you listen to these, and they only watch Fox News, they know that Elon Musk is not abiding by the Constitution. They know that people are suffering from the things that his effort to cut costs. I'm not going to call it a name because it's fake. They know that Donald Trump is totally unchecked, and 81% of all Americans still think that Putin's the bad guy. You didn't learn that on Fox. I mean, people aren't hostage to low information. They just didn't think that the Congress would collapse. They didn't think they'd hand the drunk uncle the keys.
Sure. Or maybe they didn't care. I mean, personally, I think it's somewhere in between here. But I think Donald Trump speaks to a certain baseline of politics that is often incorrect, which is the economy was bad, I'm going to make it better.
Yeah.
We're weak, we're going to be stronger. And most voters say, yeah, that's the direction I want to go. And they don't understand the dismantling of the Department of Justice. I think there are a lot of informed voters, and I certainly don't mean that nobody's paying attention. People are.
Yeah.
We're seeing it.
It had to get this bad, though.
It had to get this bad.
Yeah, okay.